sell in the United States. And this eventually, in the Wall Street Journal of all things, there is a for sale ad for a Dead Sea Scroll that appears, I think, in 1950. And it's really funny. It says, "Would make a great gift to a church or seminary," something like this, in the Wall Street Journal, and in the personal ads. And so, what happens? There are some Jews who read the Wall Street Journal, and they contact Sukenik, and he has a son who has a different last name, named Yigael Yadin. You may have heard of Yigael Yadin. He was the first preeminent scholar of Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship. And Yigael Yadin impersonates an American Jewish businessman, and he gets a couple of different people to work on his behalf, and in the long run they wind up purchasing this scroll. The Syrian Metropolitan has no idea what's going on, and Israel acquires the Isaiah scroll, and it comes into the possession of the Israel Museum. And until very recently, you could go to the Israel Museum, to the Shrine of the Book. Maybe you've seen pictures of it. It looks like the top of a jar, and they had this huge drum in the middle of the Shrine of the Book, and you could see the Isaiah scroll that was pasted alongside it. And then it started to deteriorate, and so they took it and they put it away for safekeeping. There's a replica now, beautiful replica. Nearly the entire text of the book of Isaiah. Numerous other documents were found, but no one knew where the scrolls were found. The Bedouin keep coming with little scraps of things. And at first, the Bedouin, if one scroll is worth this much money, 2 scrolls would be worth twice as much, right? So what do you do to your scroll? You cut it into pieces. And so, but very, very quickly, people said, no, this is much more bad. We're not going to buy scraps from you. We want pieces. So they stopped doing that. But they didn't give their sources away. Eventually, in the early 50s, a Jordanian general is out here, and they're hunting for the scrolls. And they find the Bedouin that found them at first, and they discover the caves near a place called Khirbet al-Qumran. Then we get this mad dash to get as many of the scrolls out of there as possible before the Bedouin take them and sell them on the black market. Eventually, in the mid-50s, we get cooperation between archaeologists and Bedouin. And the Bedouin are digging for them and actually finding things, and they invite. So the Bedouin eventually learn that if they do things on the up and up, they benefit better. And the Bedouin became great amateur archaeologists, great help. By that time, conveniently, in the late 60s, we have the 6-Day War. Jordan loses all of this territory. So Israel is able to lay claim to the caves. Now there's a huge debate now about who owns the scrolls. We won't get into that, but do they belong to the state of Israel? Do they belong to the Jordanians? Some of the scrolls are in, most of the scrolls are in Israel. There are a few that are still in Jordan. So not all of them are in Israel. There are a few that belong to various institutions. What happened in the 60s? Because at that time, remember, this is not under Israeli jurisdiction, so the Jordanians invite a number of Christian scholars to conduct the research on this. And most of these scholars at first were Catholic. And they begin to try and decipher and piece together. And most of the scrolls, after they had gotten done pulling all the scrolls out of the caves at first, we had more than 900 documents that were taken out of the scrolls in 11 different caves. Okay. Let's see. Donatism. Wow, you guys have been busy today, haven't you?
Even our whiteboards don't work, Matt.
Even the whiteboards don't work. Let's use a different. Let's use purple. I think that might show up better on this. Okay, so we've got about 900 scrolls. But the majority of these 900 scrolls are not in scroll form. Most of them are just little shreds, pieces. It's like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that you haven't seen the original picture to. Okay? And they're written usually on one side, but with teeny tiny things. And sometimes you don't have the rest of the puzzle. Most of the time you don't even have the rest of the puzzle to fit it in. So you might be taking a piece that goes up here, and you're putting it together with a larger piece down here, and it'll have a couple lines, and you're not even sure if those belong to the same document. Can you understand the problems involved? So when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is usually what we're talking about. 900 scrolls. It's really helpful when the scroll is something that we already know something about, like a biblical scroll. And about 250, as an estimate, are biblical. Meaning, it is from a book of the Bible. Of these, we found shreds, at least little shreds, of every book of the Bible except Esther is attested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. For an Old Testament scholar like me, this is really important, but I can geek out on this and bore you to death. So I'm going to try not to spend so much time on this today. I'll try to explain on another day why this is significant. Okay? I will say, I just got this in interlibrary loan. Eugene Ulrich, he teaches at Notre Dame. It's a book that came out nearly 20 years ago. And this whole book is just about the textual variants that are found in these Old Testament books. So like the little footnotes in your Bible that it says some manuscripts read, that's what this entire book is about. Oh, joy. But see,
how'd you get a hold of that? The demand for that must have been really great. How'd you get that?
So that's my point, is this stuff can get really arcane, and let's just be honest, boring really quickly. Okay? And I know that. So I'm going to try and explain why somebody like me might get so excited about some of this stuff. So these are really important for a number of reasons, some of which I'll talk about. I'll talk about one thing today.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yes.
Other than they haven't found it, put that aside. Why do you think Esther hasn't been found?
Why has not Esther been found?
You think somebody has got it and just...
No. So some of the books that have been found, we only have like little bitty pieces of. But that's all we need to know, oh, they had a scroll of this, right? If all you find is a word or two out of the book of Amos, we know that they have the book of Amos. Esther is not a very big book. So that's one reason. Esther is also, it's called a Megillah, it means a little scroll. Usually it was not included, like Amos, was never written by itself. It was always written as part of a collection of the 12 minor prophets. So that's all rolled together, and so you might lose the bulk of that scroll, but you're going to have little pieces of the whole, of some of it. Esther usually would be written on a little bitty scroll all by herself. Poor Esther. Okay? The other reason, though, is it's possible, we're not sure, it's possible they didn't think Esther was scripture. There are arguments about Esther in the Talmud. And the reason they're not sure about Esther is for the same reason Judith probably doesn't find its way into our Bible. You're talking about a patriarchal society. Think about Esther a little bit. So you got a very strong woman acting independently of her husband to kill another strong male figure. You can see how that might be a little bit subversive if you're running a patriarchal society like the rabbinic Jewish society of. I mean, think about how women are regarded in Jesus' day. So that might be a reason. We're not sure, but that could be.
Second quick question.
Good question.
There's a lot that has been subjected. 6-Day War, I think, this is a personal opinion, is the most underreported historical event of the 20th century for what it literally did to the Middle East.
Yeah.
In literally less than a week's time.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a lot of conjecture that there may have been some gobbling up of scrolls.
Yeah.
Unreported over that period of time from 47, 48 to 56.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think?
It's possible. We don't know.
It's possible. Okay.
It's possible. Things change after Israel becomes a state with the Arabs. The Bedouin are more friendly. They're more willing to sell things to Jews. Like the Syrian, the Metropolitan or Orthodox, the Syrian Orthodox Metropolitan, excuse me. He was willing to show that to Sukhanik before the War of 48, and then after that he tried to sell it to America because politically is so you've got documents written by Jews in the ancient language of Hebrew that is being revived as the national language of Israel. And so a lot of these things have kind of a political connotation. And you can see why Arabs might not be really happy about publicizing these things. Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of revisionist history that goes on. I don't know if even like Old Testament scholars, Christian Old Testament scholars, tried to deny that there was, for instance, a Temple of Solomon. And it has this, because if you say this stuff from the Old Testament actually happened, you're saying that the Jewish people have a history here. And if they have a history there, then you have to acknowledge that they might have a right to live there. And so, yeah, there's some political motivation for not acknowledging some of this stuff. Absolutely. We don't know, though. I mean, it could be. But there's also speculation, now that Will's brought it up, there's speculation that there could be more scrolls over on this side of the Jordan. And we just don't know. Because there's caves over here, too. But who knows? Yes?
When you think that every book of the Bible is represented, would that include all books are common?
I should have said, sorry, every book of the Hebrew Old Testament, Hebrew Bible.
Okay.
Yes. Now, it's interesting, 2 of the books, I'll go ahead and throw this out here, 2 of the books of our Deuterocanon are somewhat attested. One being the book of Ben Sira is absolutely attested from the Dead Sea Scrolls. This was really exciting because before this, we had, up until the 19th century, the only version of Ben Sira, of Ecclesiasticus. That's the other. There's this book. This dang book has 4 or 5 names. Okay, so Ben Sira, Sirach, Sirachides, Ecclesiasticus, all those names. That book before the 19th century was only attested in Greek and in Latin. We didn't have the Hebrew original. We knew it had been written in Hebrew, but we didn't have it. Then we had, remember I was talking about these scrolls that wind up in Cairo? This is one of them. There was the discovery of the Cairo Geniza in the 19th century, and they found all these documents, and one of them happened to be a portion of Hebrew Ben Sira. And then we found much bigger, we found a couple fragments of Ben Sira in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Dr. Umberger, does Ben Sira get separated into Sirach and Ecclesiastes?
No, it's the same book.
But
With
like
lots of names.
But we've got both, and our Old
You're
Testament.
thinking of Ecclesiastes.
Okay, so that's
Yeah.
Ecclesiasticus is different. Okay.
And I think that's why we've stopped calling it Ecclesiasticus.
This is too confusing.
Everyone turned to the book of Ecclesiasticus,
Right.
and everyone's in Ecclesiastes.
Right.
And I said, Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes. But yeah,
Okay.
so
Thanks for clarifying that.
I think that Jerome called it Ecclesiasticus.
Okay.
So blame it on Jerome. All right. And the other book then is the book of Tobit. There is an Aramaic version of Tobit that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm reluctant to say it is the same as our canonical version, because it's too small. It's certainly about Tobit. It's certainly a version of Tobit. I don't know if it's the same one that's in our Bible. There's some debate about that. But at least they're aware of it. Apart from that, the other 5 don't really show up there. Although they're, man, I'm going to geek out a little bit. Allow me this much. How am I doing on time, Dusty? Am I running out of time?
No, you're
We're all
good.
gonna stay till 7.
You're good. It's 3 o'clock now.
Okay, and I have till 25 after?
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
All right, so if you're aware, Protestant Daniel and Catholic Daniel are a little different. You might be aware of that. They're different. And that's because Catholic Daniel is based on the Greek version of Daniel, and Protestant Daniel is based on the Hebrew Aramaic version of Daniel. What's interesting is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found a couple other chapters of Daniel. And this leads us to believe that there were a number of Daniel stories floating around this time, some of which got preserved in the Hebrew version of Daniel, and there were a few that were floating around independently, and they get attached to the Greek version, and so get into our Catholic canon, and then there are a few that would just be regarded as apocryphal. But it shows us, and we'll get more into this later, that one of the things the Dead Sea Scrolls show us is our Bible, the history of the development of our Old Testament, is a lot more complicated and interesting than we had thought. It was a long, circuitous route, and yet there were different Bibles. We'll talk about what that means later. Huh? That on another day. You have to come back for that one. Some of the other kinds of documents that we got. So we have a number of, I'm just going to call them apocryphal texts. These are not in anybody's canon, except maybe the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are books like, have any of you heard of First Enoch? Or the Book of Jubilees? And then there are a bunch of books we didn't even know, like Genesis Apocryphon. There are, one of the things they have a name for it called Rewritten Bible. That's the genre. Where they take these books of the Bible and they like have a different version of them. Just for fun. I'm not really sure why they did it. And they'll add some interesting, it's not quite the same thing, but it's approaching what later we call Midrash in rabbinic literature. We have what are called, we have a lot of liturgical documents. So we have just books and books of prayers. 150 Psalms wasn't enough for them. They wrote more Psalms. What's weird is, here's another example of their Bible looking a little different. Their scroll of Psalms will have Psalm 155 thrown in the middle of it. So they had extra Psalms in their Psalm book, and their Psalms are in a different order than ours and stuff. So it shows that there were some different versions of the Bible around at that time. But we have all kinds of prayers. A lot of these prayers are very specific. You're supposed to pray it at this time, for this long, and you have to name all these angels when you do, and it's a little esoteric. We have a lot of what we call, I'll explain what this means later, sectarian documents. So the community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're here in this place called Qumran. We don't know what they called it. That's what we call this place, Khirbet al-Qumran. And I'm just going to say, at first they just focused on the caves with the scrolls, and eventually someone looked down from the caves, down the hill, and they said, look at those ruins down there. Maybe there's a connection. And there was some debate about this, and eventually they established that most likely the community at the bottom of the hill probably produced or at least maintained these scrolls. And we think, there's a lot of debate about this, but I think it's kind of silly. We're pretty sure that this community was Essene. The Essenes, I'll tell you more about them, I think, in the next session. But they were, I'll just, in a sentence, they were a doomsday cult. They have a lot of peculiar, they're eccentric from the rest of Judaism. Very distinguished from the rest of the Jews at that time. And so, to maintain their identity, they have a lot of special rules. If you wanted to become Essene, for instance, this is just one example of one of the rules and one of the things that we find in there. So let's say Josephus talks about this in his life, in his autobiography. For a while he tries out the Essenes. But to become an Essene, you had to be a novice. Very similar to monastic life. You have to be a novice for 2 years. That whole 2 years, remember, we're out in the desert. There ain't nothing out here. Except like dates here and there and stuff like that. And you are responsible for your own food because the community will not admit you to the clean food, the pure food of the Essenes until you have been initiated 2 years later. And so it's kind of like you live out there like a hermit and you take care of yourself. Here's another example. You can, in the book of Numbers, it says that if you want to, no, it's in the book of Deuteronomy. If it's writing as though Israel's still living in the camp, and you have to go to number 2. Okay, the Torah has all kinds of stuff in it, and even things like this. Okay, so you have to go to the bathroom. You don't do it in the middle of the camp. Heavens no. It's kind of funny. It says because the Lord walks about in the camp, right? It's kind of a joke in the book of Deuteronomy. See, the Hebrews don't have any problems with putting jokes in their Bible. We shouldn't either, but sometimes we're like, but it's there. It says it, okay? So don't do that in the camp. The Lord walks about in the camp. You don't want him stepping in it, and like, right? So you go out a distance. It doesn't say exactly how far, but you have to go outside of the camp with your shovel, and you do your business and you cover it up.
Didn't they go into cave? Like Saul and David found them.
Well, that might, as long as it's not in the camp.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, the Essenes, they need more than just like vague rules. They want it to be specified, and so they say you have to go a 3,000 cubit journey outside of the camp. Okay? But here's the thing. On the Sabbath, you can only walk 2,000 cubits. Do you understand the implications of this?
I certainly don't.
So on the Sabbath, you want to be careful what you eat before the Sabbath, right? This is the sort of thing that you find in these sectarian documents. They're not just giving, it's not just 10 Commandments type stuff. It's very specific rules of how you're supposed to live your life. And they get like all up in your business here. And this is certainly not for everybody. Okay? And this is all listed out in the sectarian documents. Some of the ones you might have heard of are the Damascus document. Has anyone heard of this? Some of you might have, there's another one called the Temple Scroll, which there's a good example, it was just published 3 days ago. Did you hear about this? The University of Haifa decoded the last of the Dead Sea Scrolls that was in their possession. It's a sectarian document. It has to do with their weird calendar. The Essenes, and we knew about their calendar before, but this is just another witness to this. The Essenes have a solar calendar. The Jews have a lunar calendar. the Pharisaic Jews. So we got some strange things like this. So we have these are the major. One other thing that we get, and we're going to spend some time on this. Well, let's just say I'm trying to think how I class these together. I'm going to call these exegetical documents. I know that's a big name. All it means is interpretation. Okay? So we have, maybe you've heard of the Pesher documents. These are interpretations, and we'll spend some time on that because this is really interesting and important for understanding the New Testament, actually. The way they understand the Old Testament. And also we have what are called Florilegium. It's a whole collection of passages from the Old Testament that are brought together on a common theme. So that one of the famous Florilegium is Florilegia is a collection of messianic passages, and they just bring them all together, and it's like a series of testimonies from the Bible. So this is important because it shows us how the Essenes read their Bible, which becomes our Old Testament. And there are a lot of parallels to the New Testament, so we're going to spend some time on this. Okay, any questions about these? Yes, Dusty.
Is there any, I've heard people discuss when they try to reconcile the timeline of Holy Week, for example, they'll talk about the
calendars.
Yeah, is there anything, but do you think there's anything to that, or is that...
I'll go ahead and talk about that, because I don't know if I'll talk about it later, but and it's interesting and important. Do any of you know Malcolm Harris?
Yes, he's...
Yeah, he teaches at Friends.
He's at Blessed Sacrament.
Yeah, he goes to Blessed Sacrament.
Yeah.
Friend of mine. He's an economics professor. He is convinced that, by way of a French, she's a good scholar, but she's wrong, named Annie Jabert. And she wrote a book about this, and he's always trying to get me, like, no, it's wrong. So, here's the thing. If you read the Gospels carefully, John chapter 19 is very clear that the day on which Jesus is crucified is the day that they are slaughtering the Passover lamb. That is the eve of Passover. What do the Synoptics say? When is Passover in the Synoptics?
Holy Thursday.
Because Jesus and the apostles eat a Passover Seder, a Passover meal. So the Passover lambs have to have already been sacrificed on Thursday before they eat their dinner. And so there's been a lot, like how we have it's a flat out contradiction, okay, in the Gospels. So what do we do with this? So we have to reconcile this somehow and come along. So we find the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they have this strange calendar, and they're like, aha! The Synoptics are using one calendar, like the Pharisee calendar, and John's using the Essene calendar, or vice versa. And then Annie Jabert comes up with this big, complicated theory, and so she tries to say that Jesus is actually using the Essene. He's not an Essene, but he's using the Essene calendar. Why? That's my problem with it. Is why would Jesus use a calendar from this oddball, really weird group that won't let you poop on the Sabbath, right? You see what I'm saying? They're kind of a fringe, almost kind of a cult group. I'm not going to, now they do have some influence on the New Testament that we have to deal with, but this is not it. I'm absolutely convinced of this. It just doesn't make sense that Jesus or the evangelists would be using this weird calendar that no normal Jews use this calendar.
Were some of the apostles Essenes?
That is an interesting question. I don't think so.
Okay.
But we are going to have to talk about John. Because John has a lot of points of contact with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't think that means he's Essene. But he knows their language. He does. He does. Really quickly, I'll just tell you what I think is going on there. Is the evangelists don't really care about historical chronology. They care about telling the theological meaning of the Passion. and Jesus is the Passover in some sense. For the Synoptics, they're trying to show the connection between our Eucharist and the Passover rite, which is absolutely true. John wants to show that when Jesus is being sacrificed on the cross, the lambs in the temple are being sacrificed. That's what's going on. That's all. I don't think we need to get bent out of shape because there's a contradiction. There's a meaning in the contradiction is the point. And I'm comfortable with that. It's not the Bible's not wrong. You can only be wrong if you're intending to say something and you make a mistake. And they weren't intending to make a chronologically precise statement there. Yes?
Do you know where did they come from, the Essenes? Do you know what the origin?
Oh, we'll talk more about them.
Mhm.
I can't get into that
And
today.
they disappeared? The Essenes disappeared? Or still
Yeah. Although we'll talk about where they might have gone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think some of their stuff is with us today,
Mm-hmm.
and we didn't even know it. So we'll have to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What is the Gabriel revelation?
Oh, that's another weird text.
Yeah.
That's more sensational stuff.
Well, I
And we're-
like sensation.
Yeah, okay, so there was one of... This is a text that was discovered... Here's the problem.
Is it legitimate?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a forgery.
Oh.
There are a lot of forgeries circulating in Israel these days, and they're so good. They fooled experts. The Israel Museum has displayed a number of things that were found to be forgery. I was just reading about this exquisite pomegranate that has inscribed in ancient Paleo-Hebrew Kadesh Lakanim, which means holy to the priests. And they said, oh, this must have been on top of a scepter that the high priest used in the temple and all this stuff. And sure enough, the ivory is from a hippo tusk. I didn't know about hippo ivory until I read this article, but it's from a hippo tusk that dates back to way before the time of the Temple of Solomon. And that's our first clue. It's not got the right time. It's too old.
Right.
Mm.
And then they got to, it'd been in like for a couple decades in the Israel Museum, and they started looking at the engraving. They noticed it chopped through the patina, the old film on the ivory, and it was a new engraving that somebody had found this legitimately old artifact, but they, it wasn't enough for it just to be passed off as like this old artifact. They wanted it to be connected to the Temple of Solomon, so they forged an inscription on it. It happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that the Gabriel thing that you're talking about,
That's fairly recent, like 2007, am I right?
yeah,
Roughly?
there was, and if you look, almost all these things come from the same antiquity shop. This guy made a killing. He was actually thrown in jail for it. I think it's the same guy. Was in this, but I know that one was a forgery.
Have you been there? Have you been to this area?
Yeah, numerous times. Yeah,
Really?
not much to see there.
No, have you seen the caves?
Yeah, I haven't been in the caves.
Why did they keep them in the caves?
Okay, so we don't really know, but what we think, it used to be, there's this idea, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about the Essenes. The Romans come, we know Qumran was destroyed 67 AD, during the Jewish revolt against Rome. The story used to be that the Essenes in Qumran see the Romans coming, they take all the scrolls up to the caves to hide them. But then they noticed that there was a lot of wood material in some of the caves, almost like there had been a bookcase or something. And we actually think that they used the caves as libraries. And we know they used some of the caves actually as living quarters. We don't think they actually lived in this site at all. We think they lived in the caves above it. And they just used this as their place of work and study and prayer. So, more on that when we talk about the
They put the paper there, they put them inside ceramic containers. Or...
Yeah. So, it wasn't a library like our library. If you walked into their library, it would look very different. Because they don't have nice codices like we have today. So you got to store your scrolls somehow, and one nice way to do that would be to put it in a jar. But there were special jars. Here's the thing: it wasn't like, oh, the Romans are coming. Here's a peanut butter jar. It wasn't like that, because these jars were actually, if you look at them, if this is the base of where the jar is, the jar stands tall, and it's tall and skinny. These are jars that are specially crafted to store scrolls in. So,
And
you're
the
right
scrolls
next to the pickles.
were written in skin, on the skin?
Yes, they're written
Maybe
on.
paper.
We find some papyri there. We think they probably had a lot of papyri, but it has disintegrated. Here's the thing: when you imagine these caves, you're imagining this dry, dusty place, and it is dry. But there are also things like bats, and I've heard descriptions of the excavations. I mean, they had to wear masks because they're up to their ankles in bat guano and all the bugs that crawl around in it. And if any of these scrolls are exposed, they're getting eaten by the bugs that are eating the guano that has landed on the scrolls. So the ones that are in the jars were preserved fairly well, but even they have problems. Yeah, and as soon as they were taken away from here, so this is the lowest point on Earth. This is you can't go lower than the Dead Sea. But you take them up into the hills, it's much more humid, and immediately they start to deteriorate. That's why they had to take the Isaiah scroll off that drum. It's almost time to end. I just want to say one last thing about these, and then I'll answer a few more questions if you have them. The reason this is so significant, let's just talk about these. We're going to talk about these other things next time. But I want to talk about why the biblical scrolls are so significant. No, just the finding of the scrolls, not what they say about them, not about the differences, although that stuff's all fascinating to me, probably more so than it would be to you. But the reason this is so important is prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, our oldest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, not the Greek version of the Old Testament, but the Hebrew Bible, are what is called the Masoretic text. And our oldest copy, well, there are two, and they're kind of around the same time. We have the Aleppo Codex, which some people think was actually written out by Maimonides. This is also in the Shrine of the Book, by the way. When I saw it, I think I was more excited about that than I was the Dead Sea Scrolls, to be honest, just because I'd heard so much about the Aleppo Codex. And anyway, and then we have because if you buy a version of the Hebrew Bible, it's probably based on the Aleppo Codex. It is your translations of the Bible were done from the Aleppo Codex, and and you can go see it, which is pretty cool. And then you have the Leningrad Codex. And both of these are our oldest complete Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible. The Aleppo Codex lost part of it because in 1948, the Aleppo Codex was in Aleppo, in Syria, in a synagogue. The Syrians rioted, they burnt the synagogue down, and a portion of the Aleppo Codex was burnt.
What did you say those three things were?
So both of these are from what is called the Masoretic text. Masoretic, and the Maser is to pass down. It's the traditional text. Okay. Here's the thing. These were our oldest biblical Hebrew texts, and they weren't older than about 1000 AD. From the 900s. So here's the thing. You had a lot of skeptics, especially like in the 19th century and stuff, who begin to say, how can we know that what we have in our Old Testament is actually what was written? How do you know that they didn't just make this stuff up in the Middle Ages? Maybe you've heard that sort of thing. People still say this kind of nonsense, which is really stupid because what happened was we discovered these biblical scrolls. And it pushed back our chronology all the way to, like the Isaiah scroll is from around 100 BC. So it pushed back our earliest testimonies to the Hebrew Old Testament text a full 1100 years. So for biblical scholarship, this is huge. I know this probably doesn't, this isn't going to change your day. You're not going to go skipping out here. Yay, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls! I'm not hoping, but I do want to say that this increases the reason we can have faith in our Bible. Now, I will not. Sometimes you can read some apologetics material that gets a little they overstate things a bit, and they'll say, the Isaiah scroll is exactly like our version of Isaiah, word for word. And it just ain't true. There are some differences, but they're really minor, all told. It's not like we got to scrap Isaiah and put the Dead Sea version in our Bible. And we'll talk more about that later, like some of the different differences between the Dead Sea versions of these Bibles, of these biblical books, excuse me, and what we have in these rabbinic scrolls. But by and large, it bolsters our faith in what, we can know that the Hebrew Bible we have today is more or less the same Hebrew Bible that Jesus and the apostles were reading in their synagogues. And that's pretty important.
I was one of those people.
Oh.
And still am to a large degree. I'll admit it to everybody in the class. Some of you have heard this before from me. I have constantly said, and I've been a practicing Catholic since forever, but I really am troubled and wrestle with how do we know somebody in a cave to a monk with candlelight who's basically blind to the Gutenberg press. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
How do we know that somebody's tired lights and the candle's going down and he's trying to make, you know what I'm saying?
Oh, sure I do.
I mean, I really struggle with, so I'm glad, I need to hear people like you that are an expert saying, hey, Will, this is proof. The continuity of this, you see where I'm coming from?
It's evidence.
For agnosticism.
I'm doubting Thomas.
That's
Okay?
okay.
I'm the guy that said,
Let me stick my
I
finger in.
openly, honestly,
You know what? We need doubting Thomases. Because it's faith that is grasping in the dark, and it's not saying I'm gonna believe whether or not my reason is working with it, but our reason has to be on board, or it's not authentic faith. At the same time, John Henry Cardinal Newman, what he says about faith, I think is really important in this regard. You can't, on any matter of our faith, including this, you can't say A plus B equals C and that proves it. There will always be a reason to doubt. There are lots and lots of reasons to doubt. And so one line of evidence isn't enough to prove any matter of our faith. Instead, what we have are numerous chords. So it's multiple attestation, and eventually, of course, faith is an act of the will. It's actually a virtue. It comes from the Holy Spirit that we have to respond to with our will and to nurture through the regular practice of it. But eventually, when there is enough evidence, lines of evidence, it builds a case for assent. And yet, to be critical, I think, is always good. And So there are differences. I don't want to go away from here saying, oh, it's just like you open one of these Dead Sea Scrolls and it's exactly what we have in the Masoretic text. But it is like another, here's something we didn't even know about. And so there's gaps. Like you're talking about, like, how do you get from what comes off the press at Gutenberg to what came from the pen of Amos?
Exactly, because if you think only in the context of the world basically, up until 1920,
Yeah.
was illiterate.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
illiterate. If you look at the statistics
Right.
of the United States advanced compared to Romania,
Yeah.
it's staggering.
So there are these gaps, and we have to acknowledge those gaps. But God, in His goodness and His kindness to us, He won't do all the work for us. You know, He's not gonna. He's not. It would be nice if we gathered here and all of a sudden, oh, then the Bible came down. Like with Muhammad or something, right? That would be pretty cool. But God doesn't do that because He must somehow value us having to make that act of the will. But He is good enough that He's provided these lines of evidence, these little threads. And so He doesn't give us the whole schmear. He's like, well, here's a witness, here's a witness, here's a witness. And I think it's enough to have faith. The story of how it gets from Amos to Qumran is a lot more fascinating to me than from how it gets to Qumran to Gutenberg.
I'm with you. That's a small
Yeah.
example that I'm giving because
But
That's great.
and there are a lot of different versions. I think we have to admit there were different versions of books like Amos, but the Holy Spirit is guiding that editorial process as well. And that was something I wasn't prepared to hear as a fundamentalist, that to me, we have to acknowledge it. But learning this stuff didn't destroy my faith in a way. It kind of like bolstered it because I saw, oh, the Holy Spirit is at work from pen to press. He's making sure that this process is being done in a way that will eventually give the church her Bible. But it was a long, purifying process. It didn't just happen at one go. That, I think, might be, personally, not to disparage Islam too much, but I mentioned Muhammad, but that's one of the problems with the Quran. Our Bible's more complicated than that. And to me, in a weird, ironic sort of way, that kind of increases my faith in it as the Word of God. You had a question?
It's a bit personal. Are you a convert?
no.
No?
No.
You're cradle Catholic.
Yep. And I have been a pain in the ass. Literally
Is that still recorded?
Yeah, yeah.
He's like,
every day.